In the world of royalty, where every movement is choreographed and every emotion carefully controlled, there are moments when the carefully constructed facade crumbles. What happens when a member of the royal family, trained from birth to maintain composure under any circumstance, is found trembling uncontrollably by a loyal guard? What scene could be so shocking, so devastating, that it would reduce Princess Anne, known throughout Britain as the toughest and most resilient member of the royal family, to a state of complete vulnerability? This is not a story of scandal or betrayal, but of human fragility hidden behind palace walls.
It's about a moment when duty collided with heartbreak, when royal protocol meant nothing in the face of overwhelming emotion, and when a simple guard became witness to a truth that would change everything he thought he knew about the woman he had sworn to protect. The events that unfolded on that October evening in 1987 would remain classified for decades, known only to a select few within the palace walls.
But now, through the personal account of retired royal guard Thomas Mitchell, we can finally understand what really happened on the night that Princess Anne's world fell apart, and how one man's compassion helped a princess find her strength again. What you're about to read will challenge everything you think you know about royal strength, family loyalty, and the price of living life under constant public scrutiny.
This is the untold story of Princess Anne's darkest hour, and the guard who witnessed it all. The autumn rain pelted against the tall windows of Buckingham Palace as Royal Guard Thomas Mitchell began his evening patrol. After 15 years of service, he knew every corridor, every shadow, every sound that belonged in these ancient halls. At 42, Thomas had protected 3 generations of royals, but Princess Anne had always stood out to him. Unlike her brothers, she never demanded special treatment or showed the entitled attitude that often came with royal blood. She was direct, hard-working, and earned respect through her actions, rather than expecting it because of her title. That Tuesday evening in October 1987 felt different from the moment Thomas stepped into the East Wing. The usual bustling activity of palace staff had died down earlier than normal, and an unusual quiet had settled over the building. Princess Anne had returned from a week-long tour of Scotland, visiting rural communities and opening new medical facilities. The press had praised her dedication, but Thomas had noticed something the cameras missed: the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight. As Thomas walked through the dimly lit corridors, his trained ears picked up something that made him pause. It was faint at first, almost lost among the sounds of the old building settling, but unmistakable once he focused on it. Someone was crying, not the soft, controlled weeping he might expect from palace staff dealing with personal problems, but deep, heart-wrenching sobs that spoke of profound grief. Following the sound, Thomas made his way toward the Queen's private sitting room, a space normally reserved for the most intimate family moments. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar, which immediately concerned him. Royal protocol demanded that private rooms remain closed when in use, and Princess Anne was meticulous about following such rules. Thomas approached carefully, his hand instinctively moving to his radio, ready to call for backup if needed. What he saw through the narrow opening between the door and frame would remain burned in his memory for the rest of his life. Princess Anne sat curled in a large leather armchair that seemed to swallow her small frame. She still wore her formal navy suit from the day's engagements, but her usually perfect posture had collapsed. Her head was buried in her hands, and her entire body shook with the force of her sobs. Scattered on the coffee table beside her were photographs, dozens of them, and what appeared to be several letters with official royal seals. Thomas had never seen any member of the royal family in such a state. Princess Anne's reputation as the Iron Princess was well known throughout the palace. She was the one who comforted others during difficult times, who maintained her schedule even when ill, who faced public criticism with unwavering dignity. Seeing her so completely broken triggered every protective instinct Thomas possessed, but also left him uncertain about what protocol demanded in such a situation. The photographs on the table told a story that Thomas could piece together even from his position by the door. They showed Princess Anne throughout different stages of her life, as a young girl with her beloved grandmother, the Queen Mother, during her early equestrian competitions, at various royal events over the years. But what caught Thomas's attention were the newer photos that seemed to document moments he had never seen. Private family gatherings, quiet conversations, intimate moments that spoke of relationships and bonds that existed away from public view. Among the letters, Thomas could see the distinctive letterhead of Buckingham Palace's medical staff. Having worked in the palace for so long, he recognized the format of official health reports and medical consultations. The documents appeared to be spread out as if Princess Anne had been studying them, trying to make sense of information that was clearly devastating to her. As Thomas watched, Princess Anne picked up one of the photographs.
a recent image that showed her with an elderly woman Thomas didn't immediately recognize. The way Princess Anne held the photo, with such tender care despite her obvious distress, told him this was someone of immense importance to her. The woman in the photograph had kind eyes and bore a striking resemblance to the Queen Mother, suggesting she might be another member of the extended royal family, or someone who had played a significant role in Princess Anne's upbringing. The sound of Princess Anne's crying intensified, and Thomas saw her reach for one of the medical documents. Her hands trembled so violently that she could barely hold the paper steady. Whatever she was reading was causing her such distress that Thomas feared she might faint. He had received training in medical emergencies, and he recognized the signs of someone in severe emotional shock. Princess Anne's breathing had become erratic, and her face had gone pale despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. Thomas faced a dilemma that went beyond normal palace protocol. His duty was to protect the royal family, but that protection typically meant maintaining their privacy and dignity above all else. However, Princess Anne appeared to be in genuine distress, possibly even medical distress, and she was completely alone. No other family members were in residence that evening, and the senior palace staff had retired for the night. Making a decision that would change both their lives, Thomas stepped forward and gently knocked on the doorframe. "Your Royal Highness," he said softly. "I apologize for the interruption, but I wanted to ensure you were well." Princess Anne's head snapped up, and for a moment Thomas saw raw fear in her eyes before recognition set in. Her face was streaked with tears, her hair disheveled, and her usual composure completely shattered. For several seconds they stared at each other in silence. The princess caught in her most vulnerable moment in the guard who had discovered her secret anguish. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice barely audible and completely unlike her usual clear, confident tone. I didn't realize anyone was." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, and her hands moved instinctively to gather the scattered photographs and documents, as if she could somehow hide the evidence of her breakdown. "Your Highness, please don't feel you need to explain anything," Thomas said gently, stepping into the room but maintaining a respectful distance. "I was concerned about your well-being. Is there anything I can do to assist you?" Princess Anne looked at him with such profound sadness that Thomas felt his heart break. This was not the composed royal he had protected for years, but a woman in crisis who clearly needed help but didn't know how to ask for it. The weight of royal expectations, the pressure to always maintain dignity, and whatever devastating news those documents contained had combined to push her beyond her breaking point. "She's gone, Thomas," Princess Anne finally managed to say, her voice breaking on the words. "Aunt Margaret, she's really gone, and I wasn't there. I was in Scotland opening hospitals and shaking hands while she—" The sentence dissolved into fresh tears, and Princess Anne doubled over in her chair as if physical pain was accompanying her emotional anguish. Thomas immediately understood. Princess Margaret, the Queen's younger sister, had been battling serious health issues for months. The palace had kept the severity of her condition carefully hidden from the public, but those within the royal household knew she had been declining rapidly. Princess Anne had always shared a special bond with her aunt. Margaret had been something of a rebellious role model during Anne's youth, showing her that being royal didn't mean sacrificing all personal desires and independence. "I'm so very sorry for your loss, Your Highness," Thomas said, moving closer but still maintaining appropriate boundaries. "Princess Margaret was a remarkable woman who meant a great deal to many people, especially to you." Princess Anne looked up at him through her tears, and Thomas saw something he had never expected to see in a royal's eyes: gratitude for simple human kindness. "The doctors called while I was in Edinburgh," she continued, her words coming in broken fragments. "They said she had been asking for me, that she wanted to tell me something important. But I was at that bloody ribbon-cutting ceremony, smiling for photographs while she—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The guilt in Princess Anne's voice was overwhelming. Thomas realized that what he was witnessing wasn't just grief over loss, but the crushing weight of royal duty that had prevented her from being where she most needed to be. The irony was devastating. Princess Anne's dedication to her royal responsibilities, her commitment to never letting the public down, had cost her the chance to say goodbye to one of the most important people in her life. Thomas made another decision that went against traditional protocol. He moved to the side table where palace staff usually kept supplies for the royal family, and poured a glass of water. Returning to Princess Anne, he offered it to her with the same care he would show to any person in distress, royal title be damned. "Your Highness," he said quietly as she accepted the water. "If I may say so, Princess Margaret knew how dedicated you are to your duties. She would never have wanted you to feel guilty for serving the people. That's what she would tell you right now, if she could." Princess Anne stared at him for a long moment, and Thomas wondered if he had overstepped his bounds. But then something in her expression shifted.
and he saw a flicker of the strength that had always defined her. "How do you know what she would say?" she asked. But there was curiosity in her voice rather than offense. Thomas smiled slightly, remembering countless interactions he had observed between the princess and her aunt during family gatherings. "Because I've watched the two of you together for years, Your Highness. Princess Margaret was always proud of your work, always bragging about your accomplishments to anyone who would listen. She understood duty better than most people ever could." For the first time since he had found her, Princess Anne stopped crying. She wiped her face with a handkerchief and took a shaky sip of water. "She called me her little warrior princess," she said softly. "Even when I was grown up, even when I was married and had children of my own, she still called me that." The pain in her voice was still evident, but Thomas sensed that the princess was beginning to regain some of her emotional equilibrium. Years of training in crisis management told him that the immediate danger of emotional collapse had passed, but Princess Anne would need continued support to process her grief properly. "That sounds exactly like something Princess Margaret would say," Thomas replied. "And I imagine she would want her little warrior princess to remember all the good times they shared together rather than focusing on the one moment she couldn't be there." Princess Anne nodded slowly, and Thomas saw her straightening slightly in her chair. The transformation wasn't complete. She was still clearly devastated by her loss, but the woman who had earned the respect of everyone around her was beginning to emerge from beneath the grief. "The funeral arrangements," she said suddenly, as if remembering something urgent. "I need to speak with Mother about the funeral arrangements. And the children, Charles's boys, should know. And my own children." Her voice trailed off as the magnitude of what lay ahead began to sink in. Thomas watched as Princess Anne's sense of duty began to reassert itself, even in the midst of her grief. It was both admirable and heartbreaking. This woman who couldn't allow herself even a few hours to mourn privately before the responsibilities of royal life demanded her attention once again. He realized that what he was witnessing was the reality of royal existence. That personal feelings must always be secondary to public obligations. That even grief must be managed and scheduled around official duties. "Your Highness," Thomas said carefully, "perhaps you could take this evening to process everything privately before addressing the arrangements tomorrow. The palace staff can handle any immediate concerns, and I'm certain the Queen would understand if you needed some time." Princess Anne looked at him with surprise, as if the concept of taking time for herself was completely foreign. "Time?" she repeated, almost as if testing the word. "I don't know if I remember how to take time, Thomas. There's always something that needs to be done. Someone who needs to be comforted. Some responsibility that can't wait." Thomas saw an opportunity to offer perspective that might help the princess understand something crucial about her own well-being.
Your Highness, in my years of service here, I've watched you support countless people through their difficulties.
You've comforted grieving families. You've been a source of strength during national tragedies. You've never failed to put others first. But who takes care of you when you need support? The question clearly caught Princess Anne off guard. She sat in silence for several minutes, and Thomas could almost see her mind working through the implications of what he had asked. Finally, she looked up at him with an expression that mixed vulnerability with dawning realization. "No one," she whispered. "I suppose no one does." The revelation hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Princess Anne stared at the scattered photographs on the coffee table, and Thomas could see her mind processing not just the immediate loss of her beloved aunt, but the deeper realization about the isolation that came with her royal position. The rain continued to beat against the windows, creating a rhythm that seemed to match the steady flow of tears that had begun again, though these were quieter now. More contemplative than the devastating sobs Thomas had first witnessed. "You know," Princess Anne said suddenly, her voice stronger than it had been since Thomas found her, "Aunt Margaret used to tell me that being royal was like living inside a beautiful glass house. Everyone can see in, everyone watches your every move, but no one can really reach you when you need them most." She picked up one of the photographs, this one showing her as a teenager, with Princess Margaret at what appeared to be a private family gathering. "I never really understood what she meant until tonight." Thomas remained quiet, sensing that Princess Anne needed to work through these thoughts aloud. His experience with traumatized individuals had taught him that sometimes the most helpful thing he could do was simply listen without trying to offer solutions or comfort that might feel hollow. "The irony is devastating," Princess Anne continued, her fingers tracing the edge of the photograph. "Margaret spent her entire life being criticized for putting her personal desires before duty. The press called her selfish, rebellious, irresponsible. But she was the one person in our family who understood that sometimes you have to choose love over obligation. that sometimes being human matters more than being royal. Thomas could see that Princess Anne was beginning to understand something profound about her relationship with her aunt, something that went beyond simple family affection. Princess Margaret had represented a path not taken, a way of living that prioritized personal connection over public duty. For someone like Princess Anne, who had built her entire identity around service and responsibility, her aunt had been a reminder that other choices were possible. She tried to tell me, Princess Anne said, reaching for another document from the table.
This one appeared to be a personal letter rather than an official medical report. 3 months ago, when the doctors first gave her the diagnosis, she wrote me this letter. I was so busy with the tour preparations that I barely skimmed it. I thought I would have time to sit down and really talk with her when I returned.
Thomas watched as Princess Anne opened the letter with trembling hands. Even from his position across the room, he could see that it was written in the distinctive handwriting he had seen on various royal documents over the years. Elegant but slightly shaky, suggesting it had been written when Princess Margaret was already quite ill. As Princess Anne read, her expression changed from sadness to something approaching wonder. "Listen to this," she said, and Thomas realized she was about to share something deeply personal, something that protocol would normally never allow. She writes, "My dearest Anne, I know you will read this and immediately start planning how to fix everything, how to manage everyone's grief, and make all the arrangements while neglecting your own feelings entirely. But I am writing this letter specifically to forbid you from doing that. When I am gone, I want you to cry. I want you to be angry. I want you to feel sorry for yourself for exactly as long as you need to. The world will not end if Princess Anne takes a day off from being perfect." Princess Anne's voice broke on the last sentence, but Thomas could see that these were different tears now. Where before she had cried from devastation and guilt, now she cried from relief. The relief of receiving permission to be human from someone whose opinion mattered more to her than public expectations. "She saw right through me," Princess Anne whispered. "Even dying, she was still trying to take care of me. She knew I would blame myself for not being there. Knew I would turn this into another failure to add to my collection of royal shortcomings." Thomas decided to take a risk. "Your Highness, if I may ask, what collection of royal shortcomings?" "In 15 years of serving this family, I have never seen you fail at anything that truly mattered." Princess Anne looked at him with surprise, as if she couldn't believe he was serious. "Thomas, I've been divorced, remarried, criticized in the press more times than I can count. I've been called cold, unfriendly, difficult to work with. I've missed important family events because of royal duties. And now I've missed the most important moment of my aunt's life because of the same commitments that supposedly make me a good royal." Thomas could see that Princess Anne carried a burden of perceived failures that was much heavier than anyone realized. The public image of the Iron Princess was clearly something she had cultivated not from natural confidence, but as a defense mechanism against criticism and self-doubt. "Your Highness," Thomas said carefully, "perhaps Princess Margaret saw something that you don't see in yourself. Perhaps she understood that strength doesn't mean never breaking down, and that being a good royal doesn't mean sacrificing every personal need for duty." Princess Anne considered this for a long moment, then reached for another photograph. This one showed her in her equestrian gear, mounted on her horse at what Thomas recognized as the 1976 Olympics. "This was supposed to be Margaret's favorite photo of me," she said. "Not because I won anything, I didn't, but because she said it was the only time she ever saw me doing something purely for the joy of it, not because it was expected of me." Thomas studied the photograph and could see exactly what Princess Margaret had meant. Even in the formal setting of Olympic competition, there was something different about Princess Anne's expression in this image, a genuine smile, a lightness that was often missing from her official photographs.
When did you stop doing things for joy?
Thomas asked gently. The question clearly struck Princess Anne deeply. She set down the photograph and leaned back in her chair, looking suddenly exhausted. "I'm not sure I ever really started," she admitted. "Even as a child, everything was about duty, about setting a good example, about proving that the royal family deserved the respect and support of the people. Joy was, well, it was selfish." Thomas felt a profound sadness for the woman sitting across from him. He had spent years protecting her physical safety, but he was beginning to understand that Princess Anne had never learned how to protect her emotional well-being. The very qualities that made her an exemplary royal, her selflessness, her dedication, her willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for public service, had also trapped her in a life where her own needs and desires were always secondary. "Princess Margaret wrote something else," Princess Anne said, returning to the letter. She said, "I have watched you become the daughter our parents always wanted. dutiful, reliable, never causing scandal or embarrassment. But I have also watched you disappear, bit by bit, until sometimes I wonder if you remember who Anne is when she's not being Princess Anne."
The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He had worked with Princess Anne for years, had admired her professionalism and dedication, but he had never considered the personal cost of maintaining such perfect royal behavior. Now he wondered how many nights she had sat alone in this room, struggling with the weight of expectations that seemed impossible to meet. "Do you remember?" Thomas asked quietly.
Who Anne is when she's not being Princess Anne? Princess Anne was quiet for so long that Thomas thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper.
"She likes to ride horses very fast across open fields. She enjoys working with her hands, fixing things that are broken.
She has opinions about books and music and art that have nothing to do with what's appropriate for a royal to enjoy. She gets angry about injustice and doesn't want to be diplomatic about it all the time." She paused, then added with a sad smile. "And she misses her Aunt Margaret terribly, not just because Margaret was family, but because Margaret was the only person who knew that Anne existed at all." Thomas felt privileged to witness this moment of self-discovery, even though it was born from such painful circumstances. Princess Anne was beginning to recognize that her grief wasn't just about losing her aunt, but about losing the one person who had seen and valued her authentic self. "Your Highness," Thomas said, "perhaps Princess Margaret's greatest gift to you wasn't just her love and friendship, but her reminder that you have permission to be a complete person, not just a royal function." Princess Anne looked at him with something approaching hope. But how does someone change a lifetime of conditioning? How do you learn to value your own feelings when you've been taught that they're always secondary to duty? It was a profound question, and Thomas knew that he couldn't provide a complete answer. But his years of observing the royal family had given him insights that might be helpful. "Perhaps it starts with small moments," he suggested. "Writing written?"
Perhaps it begins with allowing yourself to grieve properly for someone you loved, without worrying about how it affects your schedule or your image." Princess Anne nodded slowly, and Thomas could see her mind working through the implications. Margaret would have loved this irony, she said with the first genuine smile Thomas had seen from her all evening.
"Her death might be the thing that finally teaches me how to live." The transformation wasn't complete, and Thomas knew that years of ingrained behavior couldn't be changed in a single evening. But something fundamental had shifted in Princess Anne's understanding of herself and her responsibilities. The woman who had been found trembling with grief was beginning to emerge as someone stronger, not because she had suppressed her emotions, but because she was learning to acknowledge and honor them. "There's something else in Margaret's letter," Princess Anne said, reaching for the document again. "She left me specific instructions about her funeral, nothing grand or elaborate, nothing that would overshadow the grief of people who truly loved her. She wanted it to be a celebration of her life, not a royal spectacle." Princess Anne paused, then looked directly at Thomas. "She specifically asked that I not wear black, because she said mourning clothes would hide the fact that she wanted people to remember the joy she brought to their lives." Thomas could see that this request was both touching and challenging for Princess Anne. Royal funeral protocol was deeply ingrained, and the idea of departing from traditional expectations, even at the specific request of the deceased, would require a kind of courage that went against everything she had been taught. "What will you do?" Thomas asked. Princess Anne was quiet for a moment, then reached for the photograph from the Olympics again. "I'm going to wear the colors of my equestrian uniform," she said firmly. "Blue and white, the colors I wore when Margaret said I looked most like myself." She looked up at Thomas with determination replacing the earlier despair. "And I'm going to speak at her service, not as Princess Anne fulfilling a royal obligation, but as Anne telling people about the aunt who saved my life in ways I'm only beginning to understand." Thomas felt a surge of admiration for the woman in front of him. This was the Princess Anne he had always sensed existed beneath the royal facade, strong not because she suppressed her humanity, but because she embraced it. The breakdown he had witnessed was not a moment of weakness, but a moment of breakthrough. "Your Highness," Thomas said, "I believe Princess Margaret would be very proud of the decision you're making." Princess Anne stood up from her chair, and Thomas was struck by how different her posture was now. She still carried herself with royal dignity, but there was something new there, a sense of authenticity that made her seem both more human and more genuinely regal than before. "Thomas," she said, "I want to thank you for tonight, not just for checking on me, but for staying. For listening. For helping me understand what Margaret was trying to tell me."
She paused, then added with a slight smile, "And for reminding me that even princesses need someone to take care of them sometimes." Thomas felt honored by her words, but also concerned about what would happen when the immediate crisis passed and normal royal life resumed. "Your Highness, I hope you won't forget these insights when the pressures of duty return tomorrow." Princess Anne considered this seriously. "You're right to be concerned about that," she said. "It would be very easy to slip back into old patterns, to convince myself that tonight was just an emotional aberration brought on by grief." She looked around the room, taking in the scattered photographs and letters that had triggered her breakdown and subsequent revelation. "But Margaret left me one more thing." She reached into the pile of documents and pulled out what appeared to be a small, leather-bound journal. "Her diary from the last 6 months," Princess Anne explained. "She left specific instructions that I should read it, not for historical purposes, but to understand how she found ways to be authentically herself, even within the constraints of royal life." Thomas realized that Princess Margaret had planned for this moment, had anticipated exactly what her death would mean for Princess Anne, and had prepared resources to help her niece navigate the emotional and practical challenges that would follow. It was a final act of love that spoke to the depth of understanding between the two women. "Perhaps that's where you start," Thomas suggested. "By learning from someone who struggled with the same challenges you face, but who found ways to maintain her sense of self despite them." Princess Anne nodded, clutching the journal to her chest. "Margaret always said that being royal was a job, not an identity. I think I'm finally ready to understand what she meant." She looked directly at Thomas with gratitude and newfound resolve. "Thank you for helping me see that breaking down doesn't mean breaking apart. Sometimes it means breaking free." 3 days after that transformative evening, Thomas watched Princess Anne address the nation about Princess Margaret's passing. Standing behind the cameras as part of her security detail, he could see subtle but significant changes in her demeanor. Where once she might have delivered the announcement with perfect royal composure but little genuine emotion, now she spoke with a warmth and authenticity that made her grief feel real and accessible to the viewers. "My Aunt Margaret was many things to many people," Princess Anne said, looking directly into the camera with eyes that showed the depth of her loss without shame. "She was complicated, passionate, and utterly devoted to living life on her own terms. While the press often focused on her rebellions against royal convention, I want people to remember her extraordinary capacity for love, her fierce loyalty to family, and her belief that being royal meant serving people, not ruling over them." Thomas noticed that Princess Anne had chosen to wear a navy blue dress with a small white pin. Not quite the equestrian colors she had mentioned that night, but a subtle departure from traditional mourning attire that honored her aunt's wishes while respecting royal protocols. It was exactly the kind of compromise that showed she was learning to navigate between authenticity and duty. After the camera stopped rolling, Princess Anne walked over to where Thomas was stationed. "Thank you for being there that night," she said quietly, so only he could hear. "I've been reading Margaret's diary, and I understand now that she had been worried about me for quite some time. She wrote about watching me become more and more isolated, more concerned with perfection than with connection." Thomas could see that Princess Anne had been processing far more than just grief over the past few days. She looked tired, but it was the exhaustion of someone doing difficult emotional work rather than the devastation he had witnessed in the sitting room. "How are you managing, Your Highness?" Thomas asked, genuinely concerned about her well-being. Princess Anne smiled slightly, and Thomas was surprised to see that it reached her eyes, something that had been rare in their previous interactions.
It's strange, she said.
"I expected to feel worse after allowing myself to really grieve, but I actually feel lighter somehow. As if carrying around all that suppressed emotion was more exhausting than experiencing it." Over the following weeks, Thomas began to notice small but significant changes in Princess Anne's daily routine. She still maintained her rigorous schedule of royal engagements, but she had started building in what she called Margaret moments. Brief periods where she allowed herself to do something purely for personal enjoyment. Sometimes it was riding her horse without any agenda other than the pleasure of being outdoors. Other times it was reading books that had nothing to do with her royal duties, or spending unscheduled time with her children talking about their interests rather than their obligations. The most significant change came 2 weeks after Princess Margaret's funeral. Princess Anne approached Thomas during one of his shifts and asked if they could speak privately. They walked to the same sitting room where he had found her that night. But the atmosphere was completely different now. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and Princess Anne moved with confidence rather than despair. "Thomas, I've been thinking about our conversation," she began, settling into the same chair where she had experienced her breakdown. "You asked me who Anne is when she's not being Princess Anne. And I've been trying to answer that question honestly. But I've realized something important. I don't just want to know who I am. I want to become who I could be. Thomas could see that Princess Anne had been doing serious self-reflection, and he was curious about where her thoughts were leading. What do you mean, Your Highness? Princess Anne reached for Princess Margaret's journal, which she now kept on the side table. Margaret wrote about the difference between authentic rebellion and authentic growth.
She said that true authenticity isn't about rejecting responsibility, but about finding ways to fulfill your obligations while remaining true to your values and personality. Thomas found himself impressed by Princess Margaret's wisdom even in death.
She had clearly understood that Princess Anne's challenge wasn't choosing between duty and authenticity, but finding ways to integrate them. I want to make some changes, Princess Anne continued. First, not dramatic departures from royal protocol, but meaningful adjustments that would allow me to be more effective in my role by being more genuine in my approach. She paused, then looked directly at Thomas. And I would like your help. Thomas was surprised by the request.
How could I possibly help with royal protocol adjustments? Princess Anne leaned forward slightly, and Thomas could see the intensity that had always driven her, now channeled in a new direction. Because you've observed me for years without the agenda that other people around me always have. You're not trying to manage my image or advance your career through my connections. You see me as a person who happens to be royal, rather than a royal who happens to be a person.
Thomas realized that Princess Anne was asking him to serve as something more than a bodyguard. She wanted him to be a witness and advisor for her journey toward greater authenticity. It was both an honor and a responsibility that went well beyond anything he had been trained for.
What kind of changes are you considering? Thomas asked. Princess Anne opened the journal to a page that was marked with a bookmark.
Margaret wrote about the importance of choosing your battles, but also about not avoiding all battles just to keep peace. She said I had become so focused on never causing problems that I had stopped standing up for things that really mattered to me.
Thomas could see where this was leading. Princess Anne had always been passionate about certain causes, but had often moderated her public statements to avoid controversy. Now, she was considering whether diplomatic silence was actually serving anyone's interests. For instance, Princess Anne continued, I've been invited to speak at a conference about rural healthcare access. The standard approach would be for me to make pleasant remarks about the importance of medical care for everyone, pose for photographs, and leave without saying anything that might be considered political. But Margaret's journal reminded me that keeping quiet about injustice isn't neutrality, it's complicity. Thomas could see that Princess Anne was grappling with fundamental questions about the role of modern royalty. How much advocacy was appropriate? How could she use her platform for meaningful change without overstepping constitutional boundaries? What would authentic engagement look like in that situation? Thomas asked. Princess Anne's eyes lit up with the kind of passion Thomas had rarely seen from her. It would mean talking honestly about the specific barriers that prevent rural communities from getting adequate health care. It would mean acknowledging that some of these barriers are systemic and political, and that addressing them requires more than good intentions. Thomas could see that this approach would be significantly more challenging than traditional royal appearances, both personally and politically. Are you prepared for the criticism that might follow? Princess Anne was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. Margaret wrote something about criticism that really struck me, she said, flipping to another page in the journal. She said, the people who will criticize you for being authentic are usually the same people who would criticize you for being inauthentic. The difference is that authentic criticism hurts less because you know you're being true to your values. Thomas found Princess Margaret's insight remarkably sophisticated. She had clearly thought deeply about the psychological costs of different approaches to public life, and had reached conclusions that could help Princess Anne navigate similar challenges. There's something else. I want to change how I interact with the staff here at the palace. I've been reading about Margaret's relationships with the people who worked for her, and I realize that I've been maintaining too much distance from people like you, people who dedicate their lives to serving our family.
Thomas wasn't sure how to respond. The formal distance between royalty and staff had always seemed natural and appropriate to him, and he wasn't certain what changes Princess Anne was considering.
I don't mean inappropriate familiarity, Princess Anne clarified, reading his uncertainty, but I do mean genuine respect for your perspectives and experiences.
That night when you helped me, you offered insights that were more valuable than anything I could have gotten from official advisors, precisely because you see things differently. Thomas began to understand what Princess Anne was proposing. She wanted to create more opportunities for honest feedback and authentic interaction with the people around her,
not to break down royal protocol entirely, but to make it more human and more effective. Would you be willing to serve as an informal advisor? Princess Anne asked. Not on royal protocol or political matters, but on questions about authenticity and personal growth? Margaret wrote that she regretted not having more people around her who could help her stay grounded and genuine.
Thomas felt honored by the request, but also aware of its complexity. Your Highness, I want to help in any way I can, but I'm concerned about how this arrangement might affect our professional relationship and the boundaries that protect both of us.
Princess Anne nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of thoughtful response that makes me trust your judgment. We would need to establish clear guidelines about when and how these conversations could happen, and we would need to ensure that they never compromise your ability to do your primary job of protecting me. Thomas could see that Princess Anne had thought through many of the practical considerations, but he also recognized that they were venturing into uncharted territory. Royal households had complex dynamics that had evolved over centuries, and even well-intentioned changes could have unexpected consequences. Perhaps we could start slowly, Thomas suggested. Maybe brief conversations after particularly challenging days, times when you need perspective from someone who observed the events but wasn't directly involved in the politics. Princess Anne smiled, and Thomas could see the relief in her expression. That sounds perfect. Margaret always said that the most important changes happen gradually, through consistent small choices, rather than dramatic gestures. As they concluded their conversation, Thomas reflected on how much had changed since that night when he found Princess Anne trembling in this same room. The transformation wasn't just about her learning to process grief more effectively, but about her discovering a new approach to royal life that honored both her responsibilities and her humanity. There's one more thing I want to tell you, Princess Anne said as they prepared to leave the sitting room. I've been thinking about what you said that night about taking care of me, about how no one really does that. I realize now that part of the problem was that I never asked for that kind of support, never even acknowledged that I needed it. Thomas could see that this admission represented significant personal growth for someone who had been trained from childhood to be self-sufficient and to prioritize others' needs above her own. Margaret wrote that asking for help isn't a sign of weakness, it's a sign of wisdom, Princess Anne continued. She said that the people who love us want to support us, but they need permission to do so. I'm learning to give that permission. Thomas felt moved by Princess Anne's vulnerability and growth. The woman who had seemed untouchable and invulnerable was revealing herself to be deeply human, and somehow this made her seem more genuinely regal rather than less. Your Highness, Thomas said as they walked toward the door, I think Princess Margaret would be very proud of the changes you're making. Princess Anne paused at the doorway and turned back to look at the room where so much transformation had taken place. I think she would, she agreed. But more importantly, I think she would be proud that I'm finally learning to be proud of myself, not for being a perfect royal, but for being a complete person. As they left the sitting room, Thomas realized that he had been privileged to witness not just a breakdown and recovery, but a fundamental evolution in how one person understood herself and her place in the world. Princess Anne was learning to balance duty with authenticity, service with self-care, and public responsibility with private humanity. It was a lesson that would serve her well for the rest of her life, and a testament to Princess Margaret's final gift to the niece she loved so dearly. The morning of the Rural Healthcare Conference arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that reminded Thomas of the night he had first discovered Princess Anne in crisis. As they traveled to the venue, Thomas observed Princess Anne with the careful attention he had developed over months of serving as both protector and informal advisor. She was quieter than usual, but it was the focused quiet of someone preparing for an important performance, rather than the withdrawn silence that had once characterized her approach to challenging royal duties. During the car journey, Princess Anne reviewed her speech notes one final time. Thomas could see that the pages were covered with her own handwriting rather than the typed text that palace staff typically prepared for royal appearances. The personal nature of her preparation was evident in every line, every margin note, every highlighted passage that marked stories she wanted to emphasize. I keep thinking about something Margaret wrote, Princess Anne said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence that had filled the car. She said that the moment you stop being nervous before doing something meaningful is the moment you've probably stopped taking appropriate risks. Thomas understood what Princess Anne was telling him. Her nervousness wasn't a sign of uncertainty about her message, but evidence that she was about to step outside the safe boundaries of traditional royal engagement. It was exactly the kind of authentic risk-taking that Princess Margaret had advocated for in her journal. When they arrived at the conference venue, Thomas immediately noticed that the atmosphere was different from typical royal events. Instead of the formal receiving lines and carefully orchestrated photo opportunities that usually characterized Princess Anne's appearances,
This gathering had the energy of people who were genuinely passionate about healthcare issues and eager to engage in substantive discussion. The conference organizers had arranged for Princess Anne to meet privately with several rural families before her speech.
Thomas watched from a respectful distance as she sat with a young mother whose infant son required regular specialist care that was only available 3 hours away from their remote farming community. Rather than offering the sympathetic but distant comfort that royal training typically prescribed, Princess Anne engaged in detailed conversation about the practical challenges the family faced. "How often do you have to make that drive?" Princess Anne asked, and Thomas could hear genuine concern rather than polite interest in her voice. "Every 2 weeks," the mother replied, shifting her baby to her other arm. "My husband has to take time off work, which we can't really afford, and we have to arrange care for our older children. Sometimes I wonder if we should just move to the city, but this farm has been in my husband's family for 4 generations." Thomas saw Princess Anne take notes as the mother spoke, writing down specific details that he suspected would appear in her speech. This was exactly the kind of direct personal research that had replaced her previous reliance on sanitized briefing documents. Similar conversations followed with other families. An elderly farmer whose heart condition required medication that wasn't available at the local clinic. A pregnant woman who had to travel to 3 different towns to find prenatal care. A teenager with diabetes whose parents worried constantly about emergency situations that might arise when specialist help was hours away. By the time Princess Anne was introduced for her speech, Thomas could see that these conversations had reinforced her determination to speak honestly about issues that were too often discussed in abstract policy terms. The audience of healthcare workers, community advocates, and rural residents gave her respectful but reserved applause, the kind of polite response typically offered to royal visitors who were expected to say pleasant but ultimately meaningless things about important topics. Princess Anne approached the podium with the confidence Thomas had watched her develop over months of personal growth and authentic engagement. She began by acknowledging the traditional role expectations that shaped her presence at the conference, but then explicitly departed from those expectations. "I could stand here today and offer you the kind of remarks you might expect from a member of the royal family," Princess Anne began, her voice clear and steady. "I could speak in general terms about the importance of healthcare access for all citizens, express admiration for the dedicated professionals who serve rural communities, and wish you well in your important work. Those sentiments would be genuine, but they would also be insufficient." Thomas could see surprise and interest ripple through the audience. This was clearly not the standard royal speech they had anticipated, and Princess Anne's direct acknowledgement of typical royal limitations had immediately captured their attention. "Instead, I want to tell you about 3 families I met this morning," Princess Anne continued, "because their stories illustrate challenges that policy discussions often obscure with diplomatic language and statistical abstractions." What followed was the most powerful speech Thomas had ever heard Princess Anne deliver. She told the story of baby James, whose parents faced impossible choices between his medical needs and their family's economic survival. She described the isolation experienced by elderly patients whose health conditions were manageable with proper care, but became life-threatening when that care was geographically inaccessible. She spoke about the teenage girl whose diabetes management had been complicated by the lack of local specialists who understood the unique challenges faced by young people in rural settings. Throughout her speech, Princess Anne was careful to focus on human experiences rather than policy prescriptions. She didn't propose specific government actions or criticize particular political decisions, but she made the human cost of inadequate rural healthcare impossible to ignore. The audience's initial polite attention had transformed into engaged listening, and Thomas could see people taking notes, nodding in recognition, and occasionally wiping away tears. "These families are not asking for special consideration because of their geographic circumstances," Princess Anne said as she neared the conclusion of her remarks. "They are asking for the same access to health care that families in urban areas take for granted. The question isn't whether we can afford to address these disparities. The question is whether we can afford to ignore them." Thomas watched the audience's response as Princess Anne finished her speech. The applause was immediate, sustained, and qualitatively different from the polite recognition that usually greeted royal appearances. These people were responding to Princess Anne not as a royal performing a duty, but as a person who had genuinely heard their concerns and was willing to speak about them publicly. During the question and answer session that followed, Princess Anne demonstrated another aspect of her authentic engagement. Instead of deflecting difficult questions with diplomatic non-answers, she acknowledged the complexity of healthcare policy while maintaining focus on human impacts. "Your Royal Highness," asked a rural doctor, "what can someone in your position actually do to influence the systemic changes that would address these problems?" "I cannot make policy or direct government resources," she said honestly.
but I can ensure that these stories are heard by people who do have that power. I can use my platform to keep these issues visible in national conversations that often focus on urban priorities. And I can continue to listen to communities like yours so that my understanding remains grounded in real experiences rather than abstract theories. Thomas recognized that Princess Anne's response exemplified the approach she had developed through months of reflection on royal effectiveness. She was neither claiming power she didn't possess nor dismissing the influence she did have.
Instead, she was defining a role for modern royalty that emphasized authentic engagement and strategic advocacy within constitutional constraints. After the conference, during the drive back to London, Princess Anne was unusually quiet. Thomas could see that she was processing the experience, evaluating not just how her speech had been received, but what it might mean for her future approach to royal service. "That felt completely different," Princess Anne said finally. "For the first time in my life, I felt like I was using my royal platform for something more meaningful than ceremony and symbolism." Thomas could hear both satisfaction and uncertainty in her voice. The day had clearly been successful in terms of audience engagement and authentic communication, but Princess Anne was aware that the real test would come in how the speech was received by the press, the palace, and the political establishment. "How do you think it went?" Thomas asked, curious about her own assessment of the experience.
Princess Anne smiled, and Thomas saw in her expression the confidence that came from acting in alignment with her values rather than simply meeting external expectations. "I think Margaret would have been proud," she said. "I spoke honestly about things that matter, I maintained appropriate boundaries, and I remembered that my job is to serve people, not to protect myself from criticism." Over the following days, Thomas watched as Princess Anne's speech generated exactly the kind of response she had hoped for.
Rural healthcare advocates praised her for bringing national attention to issues that were often overlooked in policy discussions. Medical professionals appreciated her focus on human stories rather than political positioning.
Most importantly, several government officials indicated that they were interested in discussing rural healthcare challenges with Princess Anne in greater detail. The press coverage was largely positive, though some commentators questioned whether Princess Anne's more engaged approach was appropriate for someone in her constitutional position. These criticisms seemed to trouble Princess Anne far less than Thomas had expected, and he realized that her months of preparation had included developing emotional resilience for exactly this kind of response. Margaret was right about criticism, Princess Anne told Thomas during one of their regular conversations in the sitting room. "The people who are upset that I spoke substantively about healthcare access are not people whose opinions I need to prioritize.
The families I met at the conference, the healthcare workers who are dealing with these challenges every day, those are the people whose responses matter to me." Thomas could see that Princess Anne had internalized one of her aunt's most important lessons. Authentic action inevitably generates both support and opposition, and the key to sustainable authenticity is learning to value the right kinds of feedback while remaining resilient against inappropriate criticism.
6 months after the healthcare conference, Thomas was promoted to a new position that would take him away from daily service with Princess Anne. As he prepared for this transition, he reflected on the extraordinary journey he had witnessed and participated in during their time working together. The woman he had found trembling in the sitting room that October evening had been transformed not through abandoning her royal duties, but through learning to fulfill them more authentically. Princess Anne had maintained her commitment to service while developing a deeper understanding of what meaningful service actually required. She had learned to balance personal needs with public responsibilities, to speak honestly while respecting constitutional boundaries, and to seek support while maintaining independence. During his final week of service, Princess Anne asked Thomas to join her for one last conversation in the sitting room, where their relationship as advisor and friend had begun. The space looked exactly the same, but the atmosphere was completely different. Where once there had been crisis and desperation, now there was calm confidence and purposeful direction. "I want you to know," Princess Anne said, "that helping me through that night, and through everything that followed, was one of the greatest gifts anyone has ever given me." Margaret's death was devastating, but it also became the catalyst for me to finally learn how to live authentically while serving effectively. Thomas felt honored by her words, but also aware that the real work had been done by Princess Anne herself. "Your Highness, you transformed yourself through your own courage and commitment. I just happened to be there when you needed someone to listen." Princess Anne smiled, and Thomas was struck by how different she looked now, not just older or more experienced, but fundamentally more at peace with herself and her role. "Margaret wrote something about that," she said, reaching for the journal that still occupied its place on the side table. "She said that sometimes the most important people in our lives are those who show up at exactly the moment when we're ready to change. and who have the wisdom to support our growth rather than trying to direct it. Thomas realized that Princess Margaret's insights continued to guide Princess Anne even years after her death.
The journal had become more than just a memento. It was a continuing source of wisdom about authenticity, service, and the integration of personal growth with public responsibility.
What's next for you? Thomas asked, curious about how Princess Anne would continue to apply the lessons she had learned.
Princess Anne's expression became thoughtful, and Thomas could see that she was still actively developing her approach to authentic royal service. "I want to expand the model we developed together," she said.
"I'm working with palace staff to create more opportunities for honest dialogue between royals and the people we serve. I want to ensure that my experiences with learning to listen, really listen, become part of how this institution operates." Thomas could see that Princess Anne's transformation had implications that extended far beyond her personal growth.
She was working to change not just how she fulfilled her royal role, but how royalty itself could function more effectively in a modern democracy. As Thomas prepared to leave the sitting room for the final time as Princess Anne's guard and advisor, she stood and extended her hand to him, not in the formal manner of royal protocol, but with the warmth of genuine friendship.
"Thank you," she said simply, "for helping me discover that authenticity and duty aren't opposites, but partners." Margaret would have loved seeing how this story turned out. Thomas shook her hand, feeling both sadness at ending this unique relationship and confidence that Princess Anne would continue growing and serving with the authenticity she had worked so hard to develop. The trembling woman he had found in crisis had become a leader who understood that true strength comes not from suppressing vulnerability but from transforming it into compassion and wisdom.
As he walked through the palace corridors for the last time in this capacity, Thomas reflected on the profound truth that Princess Anne and Princess Margaret had both learned, that the highest form of royal service comes not from perfect compliance with expectations, but from the courage to be genuinely human, while serving others with integrity, authenticity, and love. The story that had begun with breakdown had ended with breakthrough, not just for Princess Anne but for everyone who would benefit from her more authentic and effective approach to royal service in the years to come. Princess Margaret's final gift to her niece had been the permission to be human, and Princess Anne had transformed that gift into a new understanding of what it meant to serve with both dignity and heart.